Hey folks, welcome back. We're going to be talking about generational trauma. We're going to be talking about the Pluto and Scorpio generation, also known as the Watchers. We're going to be talking about Generation X, baby boomers, also known as our current ruling class. And we're going to be talking about how we can't rise as a species until we rise as individuals. And even more importantly, beyond rising as individuals, we need to create a version of ourselves now that actually has greater potential than we were born with, which, when we go through the story about generational trauma and all that, it'll make a lot more sense. And something I want to talk about sort of before we get started is actually how our current ruling class, are probably the most terrified group of people among all of us. I think in a way, for those of us who are sort of sane and don't have to worry about being blackmailed or being exposed as a fraud or, any of these sort of worries that we don't think about, as fear necessarily, but they are. In fact, they're a very unfortunate category. They're a very unfortunate type of fear. When we think of the ruling class and we think of sort of where they came from, which we'll talk about, it makes perfect sense that the world we live in today is terrified. Everything is terror inspired. It's either terror inspired or terror inspiring. You know what I mean? So let's read a little scripture. Today we're reading from Matthew 6:34. Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough troubles of its own. So we can't rise as a species until we rise as individuals. Therefore, in order to ascend the current discourse as a collective, we have to become the change we want to see as individuals. For each of us, that means something different. For me, it means I have to be nicer to myself. For you, it could mean that you might think about surrendering to a lifestyle that's not working for you and trying something else. And today I also want to invoke the Scorpio and Pluto generation, a subset of humanity that were children during the years of 1983 and 1995. I believe this generation has a particular part to play in our nation's evolution. A March 2021 New York Post article wrote, "Cancel culture is out of control and Gen X is our only hope." And here's why. If you went through the Pluto and Scorpio transit between 1983 and 1995, if you went through this transit at an impressionable age, you were stamped and encoded with a destiny that's tied to a trauma you sustained during the Pluto and Scorpio transit. And within this subset, there's a particular group of self-healers who've overcome the indoctrination of that transit, and I'm calling them Watchers. I'm a Scorpio, my ruling sign is Pluto, and I was 9 when the transit hit. So for those of us who were children going through a formative time in our development, this was a time of great testing. Each of us carried from that time a particular wound that shaped our lives. Pluto does this as it moves through houses. And right now, children are experiencing the Pluto and Capricorn transit. I'm sure we can all imagine the impact that lack of facial connection and socialization is having on these children and how it's impacting what they're going to have to overcome in the future. For those of us who have been through transits like this, what we become as a result of these tests depends on which wolf we want to feed, love or fear. Love leads to God and healing. Fear leads to man-made solutions and more confusion. So now let's take a step back to understand who the Watchers are. And to understand that, you first have to understand who the baby boomers are. And the baby boomers are generally categorized as people born following World War II, when there was a temporary marked increase in birth rate between 1946 and 1964. My grandparents, the baby boomers' parents, survived the Great Depression. They survived World War II, and when they came back from World War II, they brought back a level of post-traumatic stress that is beyond anything we could comprehend. They also brought back a lot of nefarious technologies from the enemy that were ultimately studied and deployed as multimedia strategies through what was then a budding news media. Our grandparents were terrified. They just lived through the Great Depression, and contrary to their decaying internal state, the status quo in the U.S. at the time was sort of amplifying the discourse of June and Ward Cleaver. So you had to look good, but you felt terrible. Our grandparents' souls were literally split in half, and most of them turned to alcohol, and a lot of them died young. And what boomers did was they learned to survive above all else. They learned self-preservation through sheer force of will. They learned to seek security. Our current ruling class, the baby boomers, they lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, anti-war protests, the Civil Rights Movement, and the constant threat, and I think this impacted them the most, the constant threat of being nuked by a foreign enemy. Baby boomers literally had to jump under their desks as children when the air horn siren sounded. And meanwhile, their parents, the post-World War II generation, were spiraling down their own rabbit holes of alcoholism and self-destruction based on uncured, unhealed post-traumatic stress. So the boomers, turned to Walter Cronkite and the mainstream media. Walter Cronkite made them feel better. And so now we can sort of understand how these post-World War II technologies were deployed and continue to keep this generation affixed to the mainstream media. Meanwhile, Generation X is a demographic that is situated in between the baby boomers and the millennials, and our date range is 1965 to 1980. I personally was born in 73. So we're the children of the current ruling class, the baby boomers. And we've been watching them since birth. We learned early to study a person's actions and compare them to their words. We understand gaslighting, narcissism, self-righteousness, hypocrisy, victim mentality, critical race theory, and double standards implicitly. They were practically our love language growing up. In an interesting twist of fate, it turns out that the Pluto and Scorpio generation is actually building the technologies that are used to keep track of us. So in this sense, we understand their algorithms better than they do. We can fly below the radar and keep one step ahead of the people who are trying to keep track of us. We are the data set that doesn't get counted or scored in polls because we know how it works, and we prefer to keep them guessing. We understand metrics, we understand analytics, behavior tracking. We know we're in a feedback loop with the people that are disseminating the divisive discourse. And we're being very intentional about the feedback we're giving them. Why? Well, this is the ascension process in 2021. Think of the Internet of Things as a giant radio tower, and each person on the planet is feeding the signal to that tower with their own individual signature of frequency. That amalgamation of individual frequencies can basically be tabulated into a mean score of where we are in our spiritual ascension based on the data we input into the Internet of Things. That information is captured and scored to mark where we are in the ascension process. Conversely, the number of happy posts regarding untested synthetic technologies being infused into humanity indicate how far we have to go. And there's some consensus that we need to awaken 65% of souls before the cat gets let out of the bag and the curtain comes up. But we'll see. So we, the Pluto Scorpio generation or the watchers have been watching our country change. We know exactly how and why. None of this is fooling us. We've been studying hypocrisy, gaslighting, cognitive dissonance inspiring rhetoric, narcissistic bullying for a long time. We know those who blame others are truly blaming themselves. We know bullies are secretly terrified. We know that outrage is just another form of rage. We know gaslighting. It's intended to make us question our own sanity as we're being bombarded with cognitive dissonance inspiring messaging. We know that if a person is capable of telling a single lie, that person must also be capable of telling many lies, and so we should therefore question everything that person says. We know that perfectionism is often used as an excuse to do nothing. We know that fear can keep a person stuck in their current development. We understand that when a person criticizes us, it's a projection of their own lack of confidence. And we know that we were taught to feel not enough and disempowered from the beginning, and we've somehow found a way to reclaim our own power. So as we look around and we see our leadership taking us in this dark direction, it makes sense to us, right? Because this is how we were raised. This is how they were raised. They were a generation born and bathed and, marinated and just indoctrinated into nothing but fear. So as within, so without, right? These are fearful people. They are in control. What is their fruit? Their fruit is fear. Now, if we go back to that New York Post article for a minute, one of the things that the writer of that article talked about was that, as usual, Generation X is sort of absent from getting anything done. And though we are uniquely qualified to handle the task, there doesn't appear to be anything happening. And this is not true, my friend. The truth is that as someone who has solved the puzzle, who has figured out cognitive dissonance, who understands this was all set up to confuse us from the beginning. For those of us who have figured that out, it's not that we're not involved in the discourse. We're just not involved in their discourse, right? And by virtue of who they are, because they don't know that we are there, to them, we do not exist. Though that is not true. We are very engaged. We are just engaged in solutions, okay? For those of us who have overcome trauma, right? And trauma is the carrying card of the ruling class right now. For those of us who have overcome trauma, we had to go within to figure out how to overcome trauma. And when we went within, what we found, when we came back out, was that none of the things that need to happen could possibly happen under the current set of circumstances. None of the trauma reversal, none of the addiction therapy, none of the actual illness reversal and healing. It's not here. It's not in the world we live in. So what our generation has been doing is figuring out what actually needs to happen. You can't heal the sick mind with the sick mind. The thinking that drove you into the ditch is not going to get you out of the ditch. We need to come up with a new way of thinking. And in order to do that, we literally had to reverse our trauma. So while the mainstream narrative has sort of been out there pounding the drum of fear, and people are looking around outside of themselves for solutions, there's a group of us who were born and who lived through the Pluto and Scorpio transit of 1983 and 1995, who have been going within and finding the solutions in there, okay? And that's why if we want to rise as a species, we have to rise as individuals, because what we learned while we were in there is that the most powerful thing we can do to affect change in the future, in the outer world, is affect change in our inner world. So while fear is raining down on us, while our predecessors, are trying to convince us that we need to be terrified and that this is the way it is, what we have been doing is realizing it's all a lie and that none of it is true, and that we have the power within ourselves to actually have greater potential now. And this is very timely information, mind you. We're in a very important time where we can actually live the rest of our lives with greater potential than we came into this world with, which is an interesting astrological way of saying we can sort of outgrow our childhoods. So while we're being accused of sort of sitting back and doing nothing, what we're actually doing is realizing that you can't fix a broken situation from a disposition of brokenness. Does that make sense? So, of course, the current ruling class is taking us in a very dark direction because they came from a very dark place and didn't fix themselves. They, unfortunately, and I pray for baby boomers because, they were never given an out. If you're a baby boomer, you can't show weakness. If you're a baby boomer, you have to be June and Ward Cleaver on the outside, even if you're in silent desperation on the inside. These people who are making a mess of the planet right now, I really have so much compassion for their situation. They didn't have a chance. Their parents went through the Great Depression and World War II. I mean, we all know the effect our parents have on us, right? They were the first to be indoctrinated into the media, and God knows what was truly going on with the media when all these, new technologies were coming over from science labs in Germany after the Great War, and those were being deployed into the mainstream narrative, so of course our, parents are believe the news is real. And it upsets me, and so that's why we're talking about it, because we need to help that generation heal. They need it the most. The people who are driving the Titanic into the iceberg right now need our help the most. So as we see our country heading in a very dark direction, it all makes sense, because as within, so without, right? As we are in the inside, so shall we become on the outside. This is why we are currently facing a collective problem that can only be corrected on the individual level. Many of us are in the process of strategizing about how to make the biggest impact. Others are kind of storming the beaches right now of public office and getting heavily engaged in the public discourse, while others of us are sort of diving deep, swimming for safety and waiting for the cover of darkness to make our next move. We know a lie cannot stand for long. It carries the burden of more lies in order to remain true, where the truth will eventually surface. We've been watching that happen our whole lives. And I'm sure the Washington Post is embarrassed about some of the retractions it's been making lately. So we understand why it's important to sit back and wait for our adversary to sort of self-destruct, because a lie can't stand. We understand the hypocrisy of a drastically imbalanced national discourse, and we know about lying through omission. And the truth is coming for the lies, and we as watchers want to be ready for that. So what can we do? Well, for now, it's very important to become the change you want to see within yourself, both in the inner world and the outer world. For many of us, it's the absolute best thing we can do to help others who have more skin in the game right now, like children. If we hold space and anchor our own highest selves, that's going to elevate the collective consciousness. Our thoughts, words, and deeds on an individual level are more important than ever. Remember, we know we're in a feedback loop, and we know where we are marks where we go next. So heal yourself, tend vigilantly to your flock and your faith, and the quantum field will receive that signal and harmonize it into the collective resonance. So in this way, we literally can't rise as a species until we rise as individuals. So we need to get out there and become a new, upgraded version of ourselves. If you've got to, read an Eckhart Tolle book, understand your astrology chart, read a Brene Brown book, know who Gabor Mate is, follow a reputable astrologer, definitely read your Bible. Do what you must, but get unplugged from the matrix and dock into the truth as quickly and ardently as you can, because the sooner you rise, the sooner we all rise. So that's all I've got for now. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.